Welcome to Interfaithing,
a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the Interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe.
This episode, we are unpacking the myth of, so you're Jews for Jesus, right?
This is a blending of the two religions, the kind of third way.
For a full introduction to this episode, please check out part 1. And now, let's get to part 2. You ready for your next story?
I
Your
am.
name Sue?
Yes.
All right.
Let's just go for it. Susan Katz-Miller is herself an interfaith kid and has been very deeply involved in a variety of ways, founding organizations, writing books, producing materials, all about interfaith families.
All right. Looking forward to hearing from Susan Katz-Miller.
It's great to be here, and I'm really excited that this podcast is happening. I'm an interfaith kid. I was born way back in 1961. So this is a topic I feel like I've been engaged with all of my life, and actually going back a generation to my parents and their interfaith courtship before I was even born. And when I was a young mother, a mother of 2 young children, I was coming from a background as a journalist, but I had been covering science and international affairs. But when it came time, I thought to write a book, I thought this is the topic I was born to write about. Mm-hmm. I was born into an interfaith family. I'm an interfaith parent of 2 children now, and this is what I'm passionate about. So I think at the time we met, I was doing the research for my first book, which is called Being Both, Embracing 2 Religions in One Interfaith Family. My parents had decided to choose one religion for their children. So I was raised, quote unquote, exclusively with Reform Judaism. And my husband and I made a different choice, which was to do both, to give our interfaith children an interfaith education. And I realized that this was a movement, that there was this grassroots social movement, especially in New York, Chicago, and Washington, but also on the West Coast a little bit, of parents that decided they didn't want to choose, that they wanted to give their interfaith kids interfaith education. And these communities were coming together. And so my first book is really a chronicle of that grassroots movement, and it weaves some memoir through of my childhood with one religion and then raising my kids with 2, and the community that we joined, which is the Interfaith Families Project in Washington, D.C. And then I went up to New York and Chicago to visit those communities and interview people there. And that's when we met, when you were teaching in the New York community there.
I picked this particular story from our conversation because, intentionally or not, she uses the word community over and over and over again. And that to me, even subconsciously, unconsciously, clarifies that like what is happening is not a new religion, is not some blending together. And it's also not cohesive, right? Like not all interfaith communities themselves are the same. They're geographically spread out. They have not brought themselves together under one big umbrella, right? Like the IFC, the Chicago group, the IFFP, etc. They're all still distinct of one another, which to me like helps highlight the fact that there is no one way to be an interfaith family, let alone an interfaith community. And people have been in the process of figuring out what this means and how to make this work for themselves for a really, really long time.
Right. This is not a new thing of trying to find a way to make it work. I think that one of the biggest differences from in terms of where we are now as opposed to before is that if you married somebody of a different faith tradition, you were excommunicated from your own community. I'm thinking of the story from Fiddler on the Roof, the good American Jewish version of the Shalom Aleichem story from the Pale Settlement and Jewish living in Poland and Russia.
Yeah.
The stereotypical idea of Jews living among them just themselves, right, apart from everyone else, fearful of what the non-Jewish community is going to do to them, such as the blessing of the Tsar. May the Tsar stay far away from us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, very classic. Mm-hmm. But that towards the end of the movie, which had a lot to do with the different ways in which children especially develop relationships and marriages with one another. Yeah. First daughter wants to choose who she marries, who's someone from the community themselves. Second daughter wants to marry a Jewish guy who is not part of the community. And then the last one marries a non-Jewish Polish man. The funny thing was when we put on that play, I was the non-Jewish guy that she married. It was awesome. It was.
I agree. My father has also been in a production of Fiddler. And I think he's sad that he didn't get to play Tevye, but.
Oh, that's so sad.
Anyway.
Your dad is playing Tevye. So, but Tevye's youngest daughter, Chava, was basically dead to him. Right. Yeah. Baruch Dayan Emet is what you're supposed to say when someone dies, and that people would say it when their child would marry somebody of a different faith tradition because it was fully leaving the faith. And we're going to be talking about this kind of idea being a traitor, and that's sort of how one is viewed. But it meant that you'd have to find different, a new life. And so the point that Sue, I think, is really making about wanting to be in community is there is a need for families who are deciding to raise their kids with both traditions, trying to embrace two religions under one roof, to find folks who are doing something that's a little bit similar and finding the unique community. Yeah. And I think that all of the different versions that we're talking about, whether it's Chicago, New York, Washington, among others, are doing it in different ways. So New York is you belong to your different communities, but then you come together like once or twice a month to educate your children together so that they can be able to hear both traditions.
Right.
And by the way, Dr. Sheila Gordon, Zichronah Livracha, who founded the IFC, always imagined that to be a supplemental piece to their religious education.
Yes.
That wasn't just IFC. It was you go to Hebrew school, you go to Sunday school, and you would also do the interfaith community.
Exactly.
And then Washington, you have a community in which they actually have clergy who we've heard from, and we're going to continue to hear from, who are kind of espousing this. We want to embody this in everything in terms of a whole community. And then the Chicago school, which is a little bit more along the model of just education, but at the same time, it's housed in a church. It's housed in a Catholic church, and how that also impacts the way in which the community is being formed. So all these different permutations are because of the desire to want to be among others who are doing something similar, but that doesn't mean it is creating something that is completely new. It's creating something that is necessary to be able to live in terms of what these families are saying, at least from what I'm hearing, for us to be able to live authentically as part of our faith traditions. And that I think is the most important element from what I heard with Sue, was that we did not want to, or what I heard her say, what I heard many folks say, is that we don't want to choose, not because they can't choose,
Right.
but because it's like, why do I have to? Like I'd be losing something, right? I don't want to give up Passover Seder. I don't want to give up singing in my church's choir. And like, I would have to give some of that up if I were basically to say like the next generation is not going to experience any of that.
Yeah.
Are you ready for our next story?
Yes.
So for this one, we're going to come back to Kate and Mariel. If you've just joined us, we were introduced to Kate and Mariel Schneider of the Interfaith Book Group in New York in Myth Number 1, Part 1, Judaism and Christianity Don't Mix. Kate, who was studying to become an Episcopalian minister, did a CPE session in which her interfaith relationship came up in a moment of pastoral care. This is, I think, an exploration or a story that kind of speaks to how sharing that you are a part of an interfaith couple confuses a lot of people. And I think that's part of the major issue of, so you're Jews for Jesus? Are you like, what is this? This is a third way. Like, it's so confusing to me. And so, what people's reactions to it are, even in a pastoral care setting, and then how she particularly responded to it.
Sounds juicy. Can't wait.
So this past summer, I worked at a hospital in a primarily Orthodox Jewish community as a hospital chaplain for my clinical pastoral education, for any of the clergy listening. And I really enjoyed it in a lot of ways, but one of the funniest things was watching usually like the older Orthodox patients just stare at my name tag and try to figure out why my last name was Schneider. And like watch them try to like put the puzzle together. And towards the end of the summer, I started being a lot more just like open with them of being like, I see you staring at my name tag. Are you wondering if I'm Jewish? And they'd be like, yeah. And so I had this one patient who was an older guy, a Hasidic man who was in there with his wife and his daughter-in-law, and just like really clearly the patriarch of the family, right? Like the grandfather that everyone was really concerned about. And so I'm sitting in there and I'm chatting with them for a little bit, and he does the thing where he's just like staring at my name tag. So I asked him, I said, are you wondering if I'm Jewish? And he was like, yeah, Schneider. Are you Jewish? And I said, I'm not, but my spouse is. And he just deadpan immediately goes, your children are not Jewish. And I was just like, oh. I was like, well, I don't have children. And I felt like a real like mic drop moment. And I was like, so take that. And his wife pipes up and goes, yet, and all in God's time. And I was like, God willing, amen. Well,
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem.
Yeah,
I loved that.
You had great stories coming out of this summer.
So I love that story for a number of different reasons. And, we could bring this story, I could bring the story in for a number of the different episodes that we're doing.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
But the reason I wanted to bring this in now is because of that sense of confusion it causes when you say that your spouse is not a part of your own faith. And the other interesting piece to it is especially in terms of the initial reaction, right? That the initial reaction is, well, you, who is a non-Jewish woman, is your child who will come from you is not going to be Jewish. And so it's almost as if to say, like, when you have that kind of binary setup of you are this or you are that, and there's no way to kind of be a hybrid, then it leads to kind of those statements of saying, well, you may be able to make this work yourself, but your child is going to have to be one or the other. And I think that's a very damaging and dangerous kind of way of viewing how an interfaith family struggles with the sense of, well, not just me, but where do my children belong?
Right.
And if my children don't belong to me because they're identified as something else, then what does that mean about my own faith identity or who I am?
Yeah, exactly. And We also highlighted throughout different episodes about the importance of community and belonging. And, this isn't just a question of how people do their thing in the privacy of their own home, right? That this is also about wanting to express yourself and be authentic in public spaces, in your professional life, in all these other capacities, and all of the extra effort that comes with, especially, as you just said, being outside of a strict binary way of thinking about any topic. That when other people have very firm ideas and beliefs and definitions about identity and descriptive language of how someone lets you know something about who they are. And what I think is also so interesting about this particular story is that in many ways, the person who was kind of challenging Kate was in a place of extreme vulnerability. He's a patient in a hospital who is potentially, right? Like he's a patient in a hospital. So something is physically in need of care, in need of service, in need of attention. And here's this person in the role of a chaplain who is providing some sort of spiritual care to him and to the family in that moment. And yet this came up and suddenly he was very emphatic, at least in Kate's perception of I am going to tell you who you are.
Right. It's interesting.
Now that I know this information about you.
So maybe it's an element of control or just even of an understanding that we're creatures who want to feel that we understand what's happening. So as human beings, we have this need to reason, this need to make meaning out of everything. And sometimes making meaning gives us the sense that we have a right to not just know, but to judge. Point of Kate's potential child of not being Jewish because Kate's not Jewish. Well, where does that idea come from that only the child of a Jewish mother can be a Jew? And so I want to kind of touch base on that in a second, but to also say that given that Kate has a wife, even in that sort of scenario, the kind of binary does not exist, given the fact that her wife could theoretically have a child. And in that case, according to even this person's definition, right? So there's that piece to it. But the larger question about a child in terms of their identity, patrilineal descent, or I should say matrilineal descent, that you are, according to the religion of your mother, is not a biblical commandment. In fact, if we look at stories from the Torah, it is the father's child. All lineage, all status is passed down through the father. There was a point in which this changed. That changed primarily in the rabbinic period. The rabbinic period really kind of starts around the near destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. And what kind of led to that change? There are many potential factors. We have one kind of hint to kind of an earlier example of moving away from just the father being of the child, but more so that it be the mother, by the scribe Ezra. When he returned with Jews from the land of Babylonia, and approximately in the 6th century before the Common Era. So this is, again, like many years before the rabbinic period. He was saying that the Jews there should divorce all of their Gentile wives and their children, that they should separate from them because they were a bad influence. And so this was the first time that wives and children were kind of really identified as not belonging to the husband or to the father. In a sense, it was kind of following that patriarchal view of the father, the husband is the one who's in charge, and in this case, can be able to separate himself from these supposedly bad influences. Fast forward, a couple centuries later, and the first indication that we have in rabbinic tradition of a change that children follows the mother appears in the Mishnah, which is around 100 to 300 of the Common Era, that kind of period. And what's fascinating about the first line where it seems to indicate that the child belongs to the mother is that the way in which it was written almost is identical to Roman law that was written at that time, in which Roman law was indicating that only a child born of a Roman mother could actually be a Roman citizen. Why? Because they were worried that Roman soldiers who would go off to all these other lands and they would do what Roman soldiers would do with lots of different people may end up siring a child in which that child would think that they're now a Roman citizen because they had a Roman father. And they specifically wanted to avoid that. And so they kind of changed the identity of a child to follow according to the mother. But what that did was it allowed the Roman men to basically do whatever they wanted to do and to not have any kind of consequence to that.
Right. And I've heard a similar historical justification, if you will. And so I'm interested to hear from you. What I've been told was, again, that sense of I do believe it was also for the Roman Empire, or that broadly speaking, if it was and has been the case that men in particular are the ones who go off to war, there's also a much higher likelihood that they will be killed. And so if you are trying to establish even who the parentage of a child is, that because they are left at home with the mother, and therefore the mother is able to instill certain traditions and rituals and beliefs and understandings in the children, that the strength of the mother's role has been, I've been told, related to part of the justification around matrilineal descent.
Yeah, I think that there's truth in there, in the sense that mothers have traditionally played this role, regardless of what the men are doing, or
right,
potentially be killed for if they're in battle, or
hunting,
doing
whatever.
a job or whatever may be, not necessarily involved. That it follows the mother, that the mother is the one who kind of instills those traditions and those values. But I want to share with you one of the teachings that comes from the Talmud, which is, if the Mishnah is the early kind of statements of the rabbis, the Gemara is the commentaries on it, and then the Talmud is the collection of, here's what the earlier rabbis from the Mishnah said, and then here is what the later rabbis from the Gemara, how they commented on these verses. Right. So there's this one section in a part of the Talmud called Kiddushin, which has a lot to do with marriage, in which the Gemara says, your grandson from a Jewish woman is called your son by the Torah, but your son from a Gentile woman is not called your son, but her son. What's very clear is that any child who is born to a Gentile woman is not considered your son, but her son. And that's what that person was saying to Kate, right? It's not that your children are not Jewish. It's that your children will belong to you, but not to the Jewish people. And I think that plays off of what you were saying in regards to the kind of power dynamic that sometimes exists when you are talking to somebody and you're trying to engage in conversation, that sometimes there is this kind of, I wouldn't say fear, but just how much do you want to have to explain yourself to someone else, knowing that they're going to look at you kind of askance and say, well, is that really true? Or how does that actually kind of work? Or don't you know that that's impossible? And I think a number of interfaith families have that kind of experience, or that it's so ingrained in them that it's hard to kind of get out of that feeling that they can just be themselves.
Right. And again, like the context of this particular story, where Kate herself was like in her professional role, which was being in service to patients. And so even more so, it would have been inappropriate for her to center herself and then get into any sort of conversation, in the best of terms, power struggle in another way that it could have gone, right? And I think part of what she was getting at was that kind of throughout that summer, the number of times that she kind of had to face those types of interactions from patients, whether they went ahead and asked an explicit question or not, like she could see the wheels turning.
Right. Yeah. So I think that as we kind of wrap up this episode, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I'm getting is that when it comes to the ways in which others, people who are not in interfaith families, kind of view interfaith families, that there is a lot of judgment that goes on. Mm-hmm. That judgment, to be fair, may not come from a place of saying this is wrong or you're bad. I love that kind of the kind of juxtaposition in Kate's story of how the man said, "Oh, your children are not going to be Jewish," and then after her reply, the other family member said, "One day, God willing, you should have a child." Right? So it's like, yes, we still want the best for you.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the judgment is not coming from a place of what you're doing is terrible and evil and wrong and all that.
Exactly.
But it's coming from a place of confusion, of I don't understand this. And sometimes I'm not going to understand this. And because I'm not going to understand this, or I've already made that decision, then they have to be put in a certain kind of a box. That box does not fit many interfaith families, because no matter how interfaith families do interfaithing, there is an element of we want all of our families to feel respected, engaged, and that we are a whole family together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And coming back to this idea of, so like you're just Jews for Jesus, like the third way, sort of, if you're just doing a little bit of everything, then nothing matters. And the rebuttal, if you will, that I think we're touching on is to say, no, interfaith families are not just doing whatever they want because it makes them feel good. They're also not trying to like rewrite scriptures and say, now there is this new thing that is the combination of Christian image. Like, I have never heard an interfaith family say that. So I think it's important to say that, right? Like, both of these traditions are unique and separate for various reasons. And within these families, there is not a goal or a plan to try to create a third thing.
Right.
And it's interesting to me, even when like this myth, this concern is expressed, because I can't help but think like, well, isn't it a little bit ironic, given that the histories of both of these faith traditions has included, even with what you just described, as far as the shift from patrilineal to matrilineal descent, like we've had to be flexible.
Right.
And in Christianity, similar things have taken place over the course of history, right? And some of it is through survival.
Right.
Right. And so as you were speaking, it brought me back to the place of, isn't it so funny when we as human beings find ourselves in an unfamiliar place, experiencing something that makes us a little bit uncomfortable, and that impetus of feeling like, how can I control this? How can I rationalize it? How can I understand it? And we forget in those moments that sometimes we're not supposed to know.
No.
Sometimes we're not supposed to have a final answer, as if that's the end, that's it.
Right. There needs to be that humility that we don't know, and that appreciation for what families are trying to do to make faith authentic to them, because there is an easy option. Just don't do anything.
Right.
Just don't care.
Nope.
Which we're going to be exploring in a different episode.
Yeah.
But the sense of like, it's too hard. It's too, I didn't come from necessarily such a religious background. And so I don't want to, and everything. It's because sometimes it is hard to have to find a way to not be within the concept of those boxes. And for many folks, like, they find a way to do interfaithing in a way that makes sense to them. That isn't, let's say, we're going to do everything, raise our kids fully in both, because there are a lot of different options and people have to want it. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible.
Exactly.
Right? Just because it's challenging, it doesn't mean that it's not worth it. And so I think that all of us who interact with interfaith families in some capacity, we have an opportunity to encourage them, support them. And I think that the sense of humility of not knowing what Hashem is thinking of, what God is really trying to teach us, and recognizing that we are limited creatures as human beings, can lead us to a sense of radical amazement, of the wow factor. That, isn't this amazing? And isn't this an incredible opportunity that is unique in this moment of history? And let's see what comes out of it. Let's see what the next stage looks like.
Exactly.
All right. I think we're good for now for this one.
All right. Thank you for listening to part 2 of episode 2. So you're Jews for Jesus.
We hope you learned and laughed with us.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And we want to thank our supporters and contributors, our families, and all of our featured storytellers.
We also want to give a special shout out to our composer and music producer, Pablo Langain.
Subscribe, share, leave a review, and send us a message. We would love to hear your feedback and to learn more of your stories.
Find us on any of your podcast platforms to subscribe, and you can also find us on interfaithingpod.com.
Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you really like what you hear, please consider supporting us financially at patreon.com/interfaithing.
So until we meet again, take care.
Stay curious.
And keep interfaithing.
Oh!